Hackfort. This is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Every year you sponsor Hackfort, which is, for those of you who are not aware, Hackfort is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Hackfort. Every year you sponsor Hackfort, which is, for those of you who are not aware, Hackfort is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Hackfort. Hackfort. For those of you who are not aware, Hackfort. 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 For those of you who are not aware, Hackfort. Hackfort.
All right.
Oh boy, we are live.
We are live.
This is Hackfort Live, our live show about all things technology, all things nerdy, and of course, Hackfort Fest and Truefort Music Festival, near and dear to our hearts. Tonight, Mike Taylor, Sean Wakely. We are joined by our friend Dennis Garcia of Hardware Asylum. Thanks for joining us, Dennis.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's awesome.
Awesome. Well, tonight, we're just going to hang out with Dennis. We're going to kind of talk about Hardware Asylum and talk about all sorts of fun things, technology, I guess. How's everyone been doing? Everyone hanging in there?
Yeah, I got this new mask. It's
Boise State.
Boise State themed, representing.
Yeah. We're all in this thing. This pandemic has definitely been an interesting time, I think, for all of us. But yeah. At least we can...
Not that interesting.
Not interesting daily. It's not interesting, right?
Yeah, kind of boring.
Yeah. I just have a plain black one to go with my attire.
Yep. I've got all my internet cats. But,
I don't...
See, Nubbins is into my mask.
Yeah, I don't have a mask for Nubbins yet, but...
Yeah, Nubbins will be fine.
Well, I guess we can just kind of get right into it. I mean, Dennis, so, maybe tell us a little bit just about your backstory, and maybe, you could maybe get into, how you started Hardware Asylum. Maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, just to tell the audience.
All right. Well, Hardware Asylum is technically the second website that I've run and operated. The first one was ninjalane.com, and I started that in 1999, not to date myself. And it actually started as an experiment because I was a web developer at the time. I heard Mike talk about that several times. And the best way to learn is just, at least for me, is to do. So I basically set up a website. I was doing graphic design, set up navigation, but then I needed to populate it with something. So I created a couple of projects. So I did some case modding and took pictures and wrote about what I did and kind of gave you a little how-to on how to add a fan to a case. That elaborated into a couple of other projects, and at the time, Ninja Lane was just kind of a blog. Your standard blog before blogs were blogs.
On GeoCities?
Well, no, not GeoCities. This was actually when I built on my own.
Yeah, on server.
I had shared hosting at the time, which was cheap, but it's a lot like the lowest level of the cloud where you don't have a lot of resources. So if you get a bunch of traffic, you might get,
Hugged to death?
Yeah, pretty much. They used to call it /dotted back in the day when you post something on /dot and then you go out to a website and say, hey, I can't get here anymore because too much traffic, DDoS sort of thing.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was still building computers. I was one of my hobbies at the time. And there was a motherboard that I really, really wanted, but they didn't sell it here in the States.
Interesting.
It was only in Asia Pacific. So I emailed the company saying, hey, is there a way that I can buy this board from you just directly? And they said, well, I had a link to my website in my footer. And they wrote back saying, well, I checked out your website. Maybe I can send you one. You do an article and post it on your website for me.
Oh, cool.
I'm like, sure, okay, yeah, why not? So they sent it over, and I, basically checked out a couple of the other review sites. There was Anantech and Hard OCP. Those were some of the big ones back in the day. Oh, and then Sharky Extreme was also there.
And Antec's still around.
and Antec is still around.
Yeah.
And basically kind of followed their format of what it was that they thought that people needed to know about a certain product.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of modeled my article after that, and it kind of took off. I was not turned off by the whole process. So it was, and the board was kind of unique. It had a red PCB. It was one of the first dual socket Pentium 3 motherboards that you could buy. And so I had to actually buy 2 Pentium 3 processors and dual of everything. And
Oh, interesting.
and it was one of those where the product was unique enough that people were interested, and I got a lot of traffic off it. And I mentioned traffic before because it was on shared hosting, and within an hour of me posting it and it getting reposted around the web, I could only get to my website maybe once every 10 times I refreshed it,
Wow.
Wow.
just because it kept getting so much traffic.
And it was like a board that obviously a lot of people in the States were probably new of, but could, work
Well,
and
they'd seen a picture of it, but they
Yeah.
didn't know anything about it.
Or
So
how it worked, or
it was
how-
one of
yeah.
those curiosity things. So,
oh, interesting.
and after that, I kind of got hooked into it. So, honestly, there was a lot. There was an immense learning curve, to how this industry worked. Because I was a web developer. I wasn't a marketing person.
Yeah.
So it was, kind of learn as I go. So it'd be like, well, I need to make a new contact. How do I do that? So then, go to a website and try to find their marketing contact. And then a lot of these companies were Chinese, Taiwanese based. So English was not their
Yeah.
first language. So there was a bit of a communication barrier there. So I had to learn a little bit about the Asian culture. That kind of helped a lot. My first trade show was Comdex.
Well, I know
It was-
that name.
Yeah, it was the first trade show that I had ever gone to, and it was also the last time Comdex was around.
Interesting.
Well,
and where
and-
was Convex?
That was in Las Vegas at
Was
the
it
convention
Vegas?
center,
Okay,
same
okay.
place that they have CES.
Okay.
And Comdex was run a lot like CES is. It's
Yeah.
just that it had a trade show, but then there was also a learning center. So a lot of the exhibit space was set up in a classroom format, so you
Oh,
could actually
interesting.
learn about different technology,
Huh.
emerging technologies,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of it was put on by the manufacturers that were also exhibiting there. So.
Exhibiting their stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But I didn't really know how trade shows worked at the time, so it turns out I went into one of the South Halls, and I thought that was the show.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out that there was one in the North Hall, and then there was stuff around in the area hotels.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, I missed out on a lot of stuff. And also, I couldn't get to talk to anybody because everybody that I wanted to talk to, it was a high demand thing. So they had a waiting list, and if you weren't on the list, you couldn't get in. Much like a college kicker. So, but I learned a lot from that, and then my next trade show was Computex, which is one that I go to almost every year, and that's in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Learn a lot about the Asian culture, helped me excel at Computex.
Okay.
And that was one where it was a seller's style trade show.
Mm-hmm.
So they were more open to talking to you. Once they found out that you had a media badge, then they say, oh, here, talk to our marketing person.
Yeah. Okay.
So then, make those contacts. And then I find that it's best to, take the friendly approach instead of a business approach.
Mhm.
Because if you can make a personal connection with somebody,
Sure.
then they're more likely to, answer your questions. So at least that was my approach.
Mm-hmm.
So that was with NinjaLane.com. That went until about 2012, 2013. Google started changing their algorithm a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned this in in that presentation I did at Hackfort,
Mm-hmm.
where people will come up to me and say, "So are you a karate instructor?" And I got that quite often. Well, Google saw it as, well, why is somebody talking about computer hardware with a domain name of Ninja?
Oh. Interesting.
So yeah, that was when I bought Hardware Asylum, that domain name, and then I migrated not everything, but all of my some of my original articles, all the way back to 2012. I migrated those over, and then I've been posting there ever since. So
Oh, yeah.
that's basically the background there.
Yeah.
And a little bit of me. I
Yeah.
do a little bit of everything, actually. So, web developer, solution architect. I do networking. I do DevOps. If it's technology, I kind of do it.
Where did computers first come into your life? I mean, have they always been something you've been into since school, or is it
Actually, it was when I was a wee lad.
Wheeler?
The father figure brought home a Tandy 1000 SX.
Okay. And was that a DOS-based machine? Or?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, MS-DOS 3.2, and had the Intel 8088 CPU running at 4.77 megahertz.
Oh,
It
wow,
was-
4.77 megahertz.
Megahertz.
How much RAM did it have?
384K.
Oh, yeah.
But being the adventurous person I was, I bought the memory upgrade kit from Tandy, so I
Totally.
put that in there. Hit the classified ads and spent some lawn mowing money on a modem. So I had a 2400 baud modem. So then I could get on the BBS boards. Again,
Wow.
dating
That's where it
myself
all
if
started,
everyone knows
though.
about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it started early on. And my dad was the type that really wanted to learn stuff as well. He's kind of
Yeah.
like me. He likes to tinker.
Uh-huh.
So he bought a lot of learning books, like one of them, How to Use MS-DOS 3.2. So as I was reading through the book, I learned command line, how to do all
Yeah.
that stuff.
Yeah.
Picked up a GW Basic book, and it talked about the different commands and stuff that you could do in GW Basic. And there was a show called Iron Eagle that was just on HBO one day. And it was about jets flying around and all
Mhm.
sorts of stuff. Well, it turns out that you can actually draw pictures in Basic
Mm-hmm.
if you know how the coordinate system works.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I sat down and wrote a program that would actually draw the plane, which was it was really kind of fun.
Yeah.
It was, a great way to spend an afternoon.
Yeah.
And little did I know, learning that helped me with what I have my degree in, which is architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So
Wow.
AutoCAD, the early versions of AutoCAD were all they were DOS based, but you had a digitizer
Mm-hmm.
that would actually mimic what was on the screen.
Mm.
And it was a coordinate system. So on the
Yeah.
lower left, it was 0.0, and you could actually draw your entire building from the command line, or you could digitize it.
Or you could digitize it. Oh, interesting.
So
Huh.
yeah,
Well, that's so fascinating. I mean, like my dad too. I mean, he bought. I'm like on the dark side. We bought an Apple II.
Mhm.
You know, and that was my first computer. And my brother and I did eventually upgrade that to 1 megabyte of RAM. I'll never forget that. You know, when we got. I don't know
1
how much
meg.
that cost, but. You know, and you know, again, my dad, same thing. He wanted to learn the computer because no one was using it, and he was in construction. And my dad figured out how to make invoices and do all these things that no one at the time was doing. And you know, it was cool because Jesse and I got to play with this little computer, and I mean, here we are. I mean, technology has been a big part of my life.
I
you know.
only knew DOS. I only know how to load like games from a
Put
3.5
a game in and load it in.
I had to type in like CD /
Yeah.
Oh, so speaking of game, I have a
Yeah.
anecdotal story here. On the Tandy, one of the games I played was called NetHack. And this is basically a roguelike game
Mm-hmm.
where you have this little hat symbol that goes around in dungeons, and you run
Mhm.
into Ks and little carrots and stuff like that. And each one of them is a monster. It has different attributes.
Mm-hmm.
As I was progressing through the game, it turns out that my 5 1/4 inch floppy didn't have enough space to save my progress. And when it did, it would take forever for it to load back into
Yeah.
memory so I could actually play. So
Yeah.
I would go and create a RAM disk, which is one reason I got more memory, so that I could store everything in RAM. But then I would load the entire game into RAM so I could play it, and then I would swap to a spare disk just to save the save file from the game so that I could continue on.
Oh,
and
wow.
actually
So you
complete.
could like load your state into the RAM, and then you could take the disk out and put another. That's so funny that you had to like think in that way.
Yeah. Well, and the computer had 2 disk drives, so I could actually
Yeah.
save to one drive. When that got full, it would go to
Oh
the other
yeah,
drive.
yeah.
But
Oh yeah.
for the game save to work, it had to be one continuous file. So, yeah, you end up getting creative and trying to work around the limitations of the hardware or the software.
Yeah.
You know, early programming stages. So.
No, it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Now our memory fits onto little chips, and we have lots of it.
Yeah, little flash drives.
lights up.
Yeah. Oh yeah, RGB too.
Oh yeah, you gotta have RGB. So yeah, it's just kind of some fun stuff.
Yeah.
Jesus. Oh yeah, there's a cat left.
Yeah, he was on my lap for a minute.
She.
She.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, getting back to Hardware Asylum.
Yeah.
At one of, I think it was CES, I don't remember what year, but I had met with Corsair, memory manufacturer. Early on in the life of Ninja Lane, they used to send me products all the time. And then one day they just kind of stopped. Well, internally, their marketing department changed, and they wanted to have a little bit more ROI. Yeah, that's how you say it.
ROI, yep.
Oh, sorry. So they wanted to have a bit more ROI on the products that they sent out. So they would send them to like the tier 1 sites because we had different tiers of stuff. But they also made that distinction on what it was that you did special. So I sat down with them and I said frankly, hey, so why don't you send me stuff anymore? He says, well, what is it that you do that's special? And this is kind of a key thing for anybody wanting to do anything in the world, right? And that kind of hit hard. It's like, well, I review this high quality, hard to get. That was my motto back then. So I was dealing with stuff that may not be sold in the U.S. market. It might actually be this Halo product, something that
Premium.
not everybody can get.
Yeah.
But that was about it. And there was a lot of other sites that did the exact same thing. So I'm like, well, I need to amp this up. I need to become special, that shining star. So that's when I started getting into overclocking. And that was something that I did all the time. In every one of my reviews, I would have an overclocking section, but I never really highlighted it or focused on it. So that was when I started my HardwareBot team, which was an overclocking team on hardwarebot.org. And recruited some friends, some people that were writing for me. They would recruit friends, and then we would actually run benchmarks, submit scores, fake internet points for the most part. But it actually turned into a nice little community around this overclocking aspect. And the way that you got more points was you pushed the envelope. So you started to do, getting the high-end hardware to actually overclock it. Taking low-end hardware and then modifying it to the point with like voltage mods and stuff like that so that you could actually push it to go faster to get more points. So that was, I hit the overclocking thing pretty hard, and that actually, set me up. I was the shining star for a long, long time. Now, of course, manufacturers have kind of shied away from doing overclocking and focusing on it, so I'm, again, that only guy that's doing it, so.
Interesting. Can you, just in layman's terms, can you kind of break down what overclocking is for anyone who's listening might not know? What that. I mean, it's simple, but yeah.
Overclocking is everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is one of the key aspects of overclocking in general. It's the term overclocking is to take a piece of component, processor, video card, anything. It gets released to you at a certain frequency. It's locked into that frequency. Overclocking is the process of making it go faster. The thing that a lot of people don't understand or don't realize is that your Ryzen CPU, let's use AMD for example, that Ryzen CPU that you buy, that you get it at 3.5 gigahertz, is the same silicon as the one that runs at 3.2 gigahertz, the one that runs at 2.5 gigahertz, the one that runs at 4.0 gigahertz. The difference is AMD overclocks it or underclocks it to meet the demand that they're trying to.
Interesting. So the chip in most cases is going to be identical.
Yep.
It's just like how they bin it or how they, and sometimes maybe not even binned, right? Like
No, it's not even binned. It's like we need to have 2 million 4 gigahertz parts. So they go and they bin the chips. I mean, but they're all cut from the same wafer. They might have determined through testing and whatnot that the ones along the outer edge are the crappy ones. So they will use those for the lower end products, and then the ones in the center of the wafer become the high end products. But the silicon is exactly the same. They might fuse off certain cores, which they can do with a laser, so that now it's, instead of a 10 core CPU, it's an 8 core CPU.
And that might run a little cooler, right? Because you have less cores. So obviously it might be.
The Ohm's law and some other electrical laws come into play. So that 4 gigahertz part is going to be like 200 watts or whatever. You remove 2 cores, it's the same voltage, but it's not consuming as much power, so it's only going to be 180 watts. That is, in a sense, overclocking. But then manufacturers will also take like a GTX 780, for instance, right? that gets released at a certain frequency. EVGA might get a hold of that chip, put it on a custom board, and then release it at a higher clock speed. So that's a factory overclock. That's one that you can actually buy.
Yeah. No,
And-
you see that all the time, and that's how all these different graphics cards companies are like, boosted or whatever, all their marketing terms or whatever, but they really are. They're taking that factory chip and they're just putting their.
Yeah, and the benefit there is that when you buy that product, you get a warranty. Now, if I get a 3 gigahertz Ryzen and then overclock it to 4 gigahertz, because again, same silicon, and if it becomes stable, it will run at that speed. However, if it blows up, you're SOL because you pushed it out of the warranty spec.
Yeah.
So that's where some of the dangers come in, but processors in general are pretty robust. The stuff that breaks is usually the motherboard or some of the components that you use to get your overclock. So you'll have memory, for instance. You can buy memory at 2,000 megahertz or 4,000 megahertz. The difference is one set of chips is been to run higher. They're the same exact chips. But if you run the 4 gigahertz or the 4,000 megahertz memory, you might be able to overclock your CPU more because there's a little bit more headroom. It frees it up to actually be more efficient.
Interesting.
So yeah, all those things are in a sense overclocking, and there's nuances throughout the entire process to get you more or less of what it is you're after.
Yeah, like liquid cooling, or in some cases even liquid nitrogen, which you did at Hackfort.
Yep,
and
that was
super fun.
Well, that's really where we found out about Hardware Asylum was at Boise Land, which we've all attended multiple times. And,
Mike's wearing a Boise Land shirt right now, actually.
Boise Land represent.
And you have generously been donating a lot of their prizes to me because I always win. But that's really like where we first saw. Like I remember walking over there and seeing liquid nitrogen being poured onto processors. Like, what is this?
I was beyond stoked because I'd only ever seen that on the internet. I'm like, I know people do this, but it was so cool, Dennis, because you really broke it down. The process, and and obviously if you're super cooling that CPU and you have a really good motherboard to back it up, you can really push the the clock speed to.
Yeah. Well, like I said, there's 3 factors with overclocking.
Yeah.
There's the frequency, the voltage, and the temperature, and all 3 of those things affect the processor in some way. So if you make the chip cooler, a lot of times you can make it go faster. If you add more voltage, you can a lot of times make it go faster. When you add more voltage, you need to actually cool it. Otherwise, because a lot of people that fry stuff is because they get it overheated. And it's not necessarily that it breaks. It's just that the silicon will degrade over time, much like a NAND flash or an SSD. Because you can use those for a few years, and then pretty soon they become slow and they'll have more errors, and then you just have to replace them. That's because the silicon just wears out. Well, CPUs will do the same thing, and that's where Intel and AMD will do a lot of research before they release a chip, because they want to warranty it for a certain amount of time. They want to make sure that it will run and be predictable for that certain amount of time. When you start overclocking it and pushing it past it by adding
more heat,
and more voltage, it'll degrade them faster.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, at Boise Land, the very first overclocking demonstration I did was, I forget the CPU, but it was with dry ice.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So it was the same container, but then I put in ispro alcohol.
Oh, and then you just add the ice to it.
And then you add the dry ice to it, because dry ice, it's a gas. It goes from solid to gas. There's no liquid form. So you need to have an intermediary. So basically using the dry ice to cool the alcohol.
Oh.
And that way it's not flammable at that point.
Yeah.
Relatively safe, although you don't want to touch it because then it will stick to your finger and actually it'll fall off. So, but yeah, that was fun because I had a lot of people really curious about that particular event, which is one reason Constantine had me come back and do some more of that.
Well, that's why we begged you to come to the Hackfort.
Yeah, same thing.
It's fascinating. I think if you don't know anything about computers, I'm like, what's this guy doing with liquid nitrogen or dried ice? And
oh yeah, when you see the big the big nitrogen plume coming up, it's like, what's going on over there?
Yeah,
it's kind of fun.
Yeah, really good educational opportunity for kids too. That was the cool part about like showing that off at the expo hall.
Yeah, and you even made a record that day, didn't you, at Hackfort, which was great.
Yeah.
Which, and that's the other whole side of this is benchmarking, right? You try to, they have all these tools for benchmarking, your overclock so you can get a score. And obviously the higher scores. And
Yeah, so I was doing, it was a GTX 1050 Ti, which gamers will know that that's a pretty slow card.
Yeah.
It'll play games, but it's pretty darn slow.
Yeah.
And then I matched that with a 9900K, which those two parts would never be together in a computer.
And the enthusiasts,
yeah, because you have a $500 CPU on a $300 motherboard with a $150 video card. It's not anywhere it's going to be the same. So, but I was benchmarking 3D Mark 06, which is from 2006, a long time ago.
Yeah.
That benchmark is primarily, when it was released, it was a video card benchmark. It was also released during the AGP days, where the subsystem, or your CPU and your motherboard, was feeding data to the video card to be displayed.
Oh, okay.
Now, with PCI Express, we can offload all that
onto the GPU.
Onto the GPU. Well, 3D Mark 06 will still run on that, but it depends on how fast the subsystem is, on how fast it will run. But if you can take some of the edge off with the video card to have it display the data faster, the benchmark will run faster. So I had the CPU at 6.1 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen. It's regular like at 3.5.
Yeah.
And then the video card under liquid nitrogen, just to get an extra 100 megahertz out of it. Because
not a lot that can.
It's not a lot that you can do with it, and it's a kind of a locked. Pascal was voltage locked, so you couldn't really change any of that stuff unless you do some real modifications. But if you make it cold, you can modify the triangle and get it to go a little bit faster. So to get an extra 100 megahertz, then I was able to set a record and get what we call the Gold Cup, which is the fastest score in that hardware category.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it was fun. And
Internet points.
Yeah, internet points. Well, and I had a variety of people coming by during that expo time. One asking me what the heck I was doing. And then some other people that kind of knew what I was doing, but then had their little anecdotal, hey, I had a blah, blah, blah happen. And I'm like, okay, thanks. And then some other people that were just sitting there just watching. Because you get this little plume coming up. And then I had it on the big screen, too, so you could see what was going on. And there was this one girl that came up once talking to me, and I'm just kind of doing my pouring thing. I wasn't really paying attention. The benchmark finished, and it's like, holy crap, I got the record. Splashing nitrogen everywhere and stuff. But yeah, it was a good time. I really liked it. So actually, I hope to do that again. And maybe bring, that sort of a system is really easy to set up, but there's other ways to make it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I brought some stuff.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good segue. And let's get into that stuff, the hardware you brought. One thing I wanted to ask you, just because I've been paying attention to the news lately, is, it seems like AMD and Intel, this has been a really interesting time from a competition standpoint. I just saw last week that Intel announced that they are behind schedule, and they fired their head of architecture. We see this stuff happening. I just think it's really interesting because I used to be very avid AMD, and then I kind of switched to Intel, but now I'm seeing AMD just come back in this big way, and it's fascinating. Like they're on a way smaller die than Intel right now, right?
Yes.
With their process, which is
their process has been shrunk.
Yeah.
So the thing is with the different architectures, they tend to go in a wave. So AMD has typically always been one of the innovators. So Athlon 64, the 64-bit process.
64-bit, totally.
AMD was the first one to come to market with that. They did a few of them beforehand as well. With the latest Ryzen system, they're the first ones to do PCI Express 4. But then with the way that the package is done, it's designed to be a modular, multi-threaded system. And this is something we talk about on our podcast all the time. But the CPU, the way that it gets built is you have all these different cores, and they just latch more on, which is why we can have Threadrippers with 56 cores.
Million cores,
But each one of those cores is not terribly fast. And games and whatnot have been designed for
single core,
single-threaded applications. So While you can add multiple cores, that's great if you have a multi-threaded application like video editing and whatnot. But for games, it's not necessarily the fastest thing out there. The small die is a process, or is a result of that efficient process of making the cores less complex, basically.
Yeah.
And Intel, it never really caught up. Again, Intel was always one of the followers. So when Verizon first got released and we have 8-core CPUs, well, next product release from Intel, we have 6-core CPUs in the retail market. And we have 8 and 10 and whatnot. So it's an iterative process, and I'm not sure, I can't speak to what happened at Intel, but chances are the head of architecture is saying, hey, our stuff actually works. It's good.
Yeah.
It actually is. The problem is the marketing and the enthusiasts that are after the how should I put this? The low buck stuff. Cheap chips.
Yeah.
They're going to gravitate to whatever's cheaper. Well, I have $500 to build a PC. Yeah. This guy on YouTube says I can build a $500 PC if I do this.
Yep.
And it turns out to be AMD because they have cheaper CPUs. And
it's interesting because, like, at first when Ryzen came out, it was like, Intel was still seemed to kind of hold their own. But with the most recent, for single-threaded, they're doing really good. And if you buy one and overclock it or do it, you can really, still do multi-threaded stuff too on top of that, which I've learned with Hackfort Live with Mike. Having more cores is amazing when I'm playing a game and having, OBS running and also streaming to Twitch and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, Darren, that I saw in the news, and I used to work for Apple and I came from them, is Apple, has recently announced that they are fully going to ARM architecture.
Yeah.
Now, do you think, what are your thoughts on that for the industry as a whole? I've read articles saying this is going to be the demise of Intel and AMD if everyone adapts to this architecture.
Well, I haven't really followed it enough, but I do have, I have opinions about it.
Yeah.
Right? So, the only reason that AMD and Intel have been fighting right now is because early on, the x86 instruction set was established and became a standard.
The standard,
and became a standard partially because of the operating system support. So
Windows.
we have hardware, we have software that's written for the hardware, and then it just cascades from there.
Yeah.
The ARM architecture
is a completely different.
It's completely
platform.
different. Different instruction set, different operating platforms. Everything's different about it. But the CPU itself is immensely more efficient.
Yeah.
And it's not as powerful though. So we could have a 200-core ARM processor, which we might have right now. I'm not sure.
There's definitely some big ones out there. Yeah.
But it still won't be as fast as a a dual core from the Quad 2 era. So
interesting.
While if Apple goes to a fully ARM platform, that just really it removes the dependency from Intel to supply them chips.
Totally.
And it really opens the door for mobile platforms for them. Yeah. And mobile computing has been huge for
That's growing and growing and growing.
So
I just the idea of me getting like a MacBook Pro that has an ARM processor, unless it's faster and better somehow than x86, I was complaining to Mike about it because I still like Macs. I think they have their place, and I like running. I like that you can run Linux, and you can. The biggest thing though is I can dual boot Windows on it.
Oh, of course.
If they go to ARM, that's probably out the window unless they virtualize it or something,
it would be a virtualization thing. But unless it can be fast enough to keep up, it won't be. I see it as more of Intel laptop versus a Chromebook.
Sure.
Chromebooks. He's laughing because he knows. Chromebooks have their uses, and it's really just for surfing the web, getting email, and nothing else because they can't keep up. But you can run on one charge of the battery for 3 days.
Sure.
Well, with a laptop, you can actually play games, run Photoshop, stuff like that. Unless you're running mobile apps, it's a 9-day difference.
Yeah.
And that is really what's going to happen with if Apple goes to an ARM sort of architecture, unless they have a way of actually scaling.
Maybe or creating, maybe Apple. That's what they're doing is new silicon of some kind that And obviously I see Apple's perspective if they can make their own CPUs, which they've been doing on their phones, and they've been very successful at it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I will say my iPhone 11, best iPhone I've ever had. The efficiency of the iPhone 11 when you're not using it, that thing just goes to sleep. I mean, I charge mine 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, my Pixel, my Android Pixel, there's no way I have to charge this thing every night. So it's like
it's like the old BlackBerry days when you could have your charge for a week and text all day.
Oh man, BlackBerries. That's another topic.
But the Apple early on they bought into the RISC architecture.
Okay.
Which was a completely different instruction set as well.
Mm-hmm.
And from a single-threaded performance, RISC was
unbelievably
fast.
It flopped for them, right?
It did because they couldn't scale the CPU to actually get the speeds that they needed to compete with other platforms. So
it'll be interesting. I'm really curious about this one because I just think it is another big move from Apple. A brave move, as Apple would call it. They were very brave to switch.
Super brave.
Are they gonna give us headphone jacks back?
No more headphone jacks.
Yeah, it's all gonna be wireless.
Well, let's check out the stuff you brought.
Okay, so overclocking.
Yeah.
Let's do this one.
All right. We've got a graphics card. MSI.
And it just says graphics card.
Graphics card. Right. This is the type of sample MOA edition.
Yeah. So here's the MOA edition. When back in 2012. I got invited by the Overclocking TV guys to help commentate the MOA 2012. And this was also a competition. It's an online overclocking competition. They had qualifiers in every region of the world. And I competed in the US qualifier. And I think I got 6th place, and they took the top 4. So I did pretty well. Yeah. But there was a few things that could have been a little bit better.
I noticed that in Sharpie it says Red Max. Is that your handle?
That's my handle. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Username. Okay, cool.
But at MOA, it turns out that one guy couldn't show up. And I said, hey, so, I should back up.
Yeah.
MSI, the MOA is the MSI Master Overclocking Arena. It's their way of showcasing their hardware. Mm-hmm. So we have overclocking specific motherboards, we have overclocking specific video cards. Mm-hmm. For the competition, they released a special edition of 780 Ti.
Okay, and this is 780, that's the Pascal or?
No, this was...
Oh no, before that.
It was before that, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
780. Yeah, 980. So, when video cards are released from the factory, NVIDIA requires that the card meet a certain limit or a certain configuration. You can get this up here. Look at it. So NVIDIA requires that certain overcurrent protections are in place, certain voltage restrictions are in place, also that they can warranty the chip. Well, this particular video card is what MSI would release if they could actually unlock everything.
So these are all these chips right here. These are like basically power MOP.
Well, those are the chokes.
Yeah, the chokes.
But if you count those, each one of those is a power phase.
Yeah, power phase that goes into the chip. Oh my god.
So the MSI Lightning, which came out around this time, was very similar to this particular board. But it had limitations in terms of how fast it could go based off of how much voltage you could feed into the CPU.
This is like
camera.
Yeah, so you can see all those chips right in there. That's how you can control that power going into that die right there. It's unreal.
So this, as I said, was completely unlocked. They developed a board
that goes with it
to control the VRM and the frequencies and all that.
So you don't even have to be in you don't have to be in like a piece of software or anything. You could literally just click it in.
Yeah, well, you have some software to control the actual clocks.
Yeah.
This controls the voltages.
That is so cool.
But
that is next level overclocking from the.
Yeah. Well, and this is totally factory overclocking.
It's probably out of focus.
And here's the cable that connects it. So.
Oh yeah, and that hooks in back there. Okay. Wow.
But
you got your OC engine button. It's kind of like a motherboard. You got some of the
Oh yeah, it's the same buttons that they use on their overclocking motherboards. Actually.
Yeah.
So,
That is so cool.
but yeah, this was one of the little prizes that, unless you were in the competition, you would never get one of these.
Oh, sure.
They made just enough for the
Completely
competition,
custom hardware.
and the only reason I got one was because there was some guy, I think he was from Brazil, couldn't make it. So I'm like, can I get one of those? Oh yeah, sure. There you go. And the OCTV guys were like, jaw drop sort of thing, and I'm like, hey, well, pays to ask.
Face task.
Well, that night I knew a lot of the marketing people, and the marketing people put on this event.
Yeah.
It's all friendly
Again,
stuff.
those relationships. It's all about making those relationships.
Yep. Now, when I brought this card home, I actually fired it up, and one of the downsides of having an unlocked VRM is that it has a base level voltage or current that's higher than normal. So I actually had to have active cooling on the card on both sides of it.
Oh, wow.
Because the VRM would overheat.
Oh, it would just be it'd just be hot.
Yeah, but it was designed to be under LN2 pretty much from the start. So they designed for that factor.
To be cold. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Now, this
AVGA VE power.
V-Power.
V power.
Now, on Hackfort Live a couple of weeks ago, you were talking about a soldering project that you had. Here's the ultimate soldering project.
Whoa.
Actually, it's upside down. But there. So what you're looking at right there is a VRM, an external VRM.
Interesting.
It's the same design that they use on the current 1080 and 2080 Kingpin edition cards.
Huh.
Or at least the 2080. But this one has a built-in EV bot. So remember that board I showed you for the other card?
Yeah.
That's right here.
It's just built into it. Right
It's built into it. But if you have an EV bot, there's a plug. I think it's this plug right there.
Plug it in your.
You plug it in, and you can
It's
see.
USB-C. All right.
Oh,
it's
there's
up to
USB-C.
date.
Yeah,
Yep.
so that you can plug it into other stuff. Here's your voltage test points right there. But you wire this in to a video card. So if we take this previous card here.
You would actually just would you bypass this?
So the chokes. This is basically the point between high voltage and low voltage. So when it passes through this point, it should be at low voltage, and this is what powers the chips.
The chips in there.
And it powers all of this stuff. So what you do is you pull all the chokes off.
And then wire it.
You wire this into that, and then this part of the card becomes dead. Powered off of that.
Oh wow! So yeah, you'd have to desolder, and then you can just basically solder this, or wire this in its place.
Yep.
Huh.
But the biggest issue though is that there's this issue of V droop, and this is again Ohm's law. So voltage over distance, there's a certain amount of resistance, and it's going to drop voltage. Well, we have basically just like a quarter of an inch of power of lead between here and wherever it needs to go. So if you put an actual wire in there, it's going to have more resistance than this copper PCB. So you have to get over that. So a lot of the people that use these things will take copper strips and actually just take a Dremel and get all of this epoxy stuff off of the PCB.
And touch it almost directly, as close as you can.
Solder as directly as you can.
Wow.
And it has to take a pretty big soldering iron to get in there.
Yeah.
Those are the high wattage guns and stuff like that. So, yeah.
So if you're really into doing it high-end overclocking, this would give you that ability to bypass that part of a board, and then.
Yep. So that 1050 Ti that I was overclocking on the show floor, if I wanted to push it past the 100 megahertz, the only way to really do it is to put something like this on there. And this board itself, the concept of this board goes back quite a ways to early overclockers that would go and take a broken video card and just cut the VRM off.
And then start testing from there to see.
Well, they would take that and then, along the chokes, and then they would just wire it into another video card. So they had this VRM that was unlocked. They could power in or put in as much voltage as they wanted. Then they could overclock a GPU that had a really weak VRM. So manufacturers keyed in on that, and Gigabyte and EVGA and Asus all released boards like this.
Yeah,
EVJ is the only one that you can readily get now, though.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not something I've seen on their website. Is this something you probably have to talk to them about?
Oh no,
yeah.
these are actually, you can buy these on the website.
Oh really? Wow. That's not something I've ever. Maybe I have stumbled across that. I'm like, what the heck is this?
Yeah, and a lot of people don't know it. But
Yeah,
I mean, it's got fan headers
Yeah.
and USB-C, and then the 3 powers or 3 power inputs and stuff. So yeah, ultimate soldering project. The last item.
Oh my god, I'm not even close to that level. I'm pretty safe with my overclocking.
Well, and that's one reason that's still in pristine condition is because it takes a while to get that to work, and if you screw up on one thing, then you don't know what you're doing. So this a Foxconn WinFast motherboard.
Okay, WinFast.
And the number is NFPIK8AA. And so this was released. There's a lot of stuff in there, so I just have to take this out. But, this was released during the Athlon 64 days using an NVIDIA chipset supporting SLI.
This is like ASMR
Oh, yeah, there we go. Oh, yeah. That's important.
Oh, yeah. Definitely recognize that.
A lot of stuff in here.
You know it's in a certain time range when it comes to the clock, so.
Yeah, so this was designed for the AMD Opteron, and that was the workstation class 940-pin CPUs. Still a single core, and it's in there. Here's the special memory because it took registered DDR memory. But if you look at this, what do you see that's a little different?
Okay, I see 2 fans.
Fans aren't on top of the processor.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't have the cooler on it.
Then
I'm trying to figure out.
you picked up on it right away, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I see the 2 like kind of like what I would call like the fans that would be used to cool chipsets on the motherboard.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the core.
Yeah. So here's the SLI bridge.
That's your SLI bridge. Yeah.
Pretty small.
That's if you put 2 cards in.
During this era, SLI was really new, and the chipsets only had 16 lanes of PCI Express. So the way to run SLI is you split them.
Mm-hmm.
So each PCI Express would have
8
lanes. Well, what happens if you put 2 chipsets on the same board?
In theory, you'd have 2 full 16.
16,
Ah.
and also 2 sets of SATA slots.
Oh wow! So you have more SATA too.
More SATA. 2 sets of PATA drives. This was a motherboard that was designed for workstations to give more data options, more onboard storage options, and to give you full 16 lanes of PCI Express for your video card projects.
And you could have 2 full 16-lane graphics cards.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. That's pretty cool.
Show that to the screen.
Yeah, you can see the 2 chipsets right there.
So this was a pretty good example of manufacturers pushing the limit in terms of what they could do with the available hardware.
Now, was this made overseas? This board with the company?
Yeah, well, it's made by Foxconn, which
Foxconn,
is the same company makes iPhones and stuff.
Okay. So this was a Foxconn board.
But at the time, Foxconn, they had a retail market or a retail division, and in this time frame, they would outsource their fab. So companies would come to them to have something made, which is something that they do now as well. But to showcase what it is that they could do, they would create products like this.
Interesting.
And the companies would come to them saying, hey, I want to have a motherboard made. And sometimes they would borrow their designs that they came up with. But that was really, they would release motherboards as a way to advertise their services.
Sure. Huh.
So
This seems really ahead of its time.
well, and it was ahead of its time, partially because of the limitations of the chipset technology at the time. And so it's like, well, we can do this. We can make it work.
Yeah.
But
That's really cool.
it was the first and last of its kind, because after that, then doing
New PCI standards came out, or
the chipsets increased. They started adding more PCI Express lanes.
RGB.
Well, RGB was considerably later. Well, I take that back. 8-bit.
8-bit was my first motherboard I actually built a machine with.
Yeah, so 8-bit had a motherboard, some of their gaming ones, where there was LEDs along this edge of the motherboard. And they would just light up, and some of them would flash, and some of them would go back and forth. But it was actually underlighting. And 8-bit was one of the first companies I remember to ever do that. And then they kind of, RGB started
its way in.
Yeah. Well, it started to come about because you could get LED fans.
Sure.
But they were single color.
Yeah.
And it was around the same time that you had motherboards with screen graphics on the back. You had clear plexi cases. You had a few little lights along the edge. But then there was, I call it the dark ages. There was a good 8 years where all of that went away. You couldn't buy a fan with lights in it anymore. You couldn't get motherboards with lights. EVGA wanted to have a motherboard where all of this screening that's on here, this is all done for QA. So on the assembly line, they have a map that goes over top of it. And this will let you know what's supposed to be there. So all this stuff.
So if there's a chip missing or something, that didn't get put in, or it got missed, or
But they were trying to make a PCB that was pure black, so none of this stuff was on there. But they couldn't, of course, they couldn't do the QA the way that they wanted to. But they had an option in the BIOS that would go and disable all of the status lights, so you could completely black out the board. And then, we talked about this in a podcast episode, and I have it on the website a lot. But the MSI Godlike motherboard was the one that changed everything. That was the first motherboard with addressable, well, not really addressable, but it had RGB lights on it.
Totally.
And their Mystic light system and everything. And that was the first one that just cascaded everything to be RGB all over.
RGB, all the things.
And I couldn't even start my computer if an RGB plug wasn't in the right.
That's actually a nice feature, though, of some of these new motherboards, because Mike and I, we changed this case over, and there was an RGB lead that I think we just said reverse wrong, but the motherboard it wouldn't do anything. But it's because the motherboard goes, well, if I put voltage on this, this is not going to be good. And so once we flipped it, boom, computer powered right on. But I mean, my old motherboard probably would have blown up. So it was also the funniest thing ever. It was RGB that wouldn't let us start his computer, of course.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's all the cool stuff that I brought. I mean, if I'm back on the show later, I can show some more stuff.
I'm sure you will. I mean, so I guess a good way to segue, is what excites you right now with just hardware and computers? Like, what do you think the next thing is? Like,
that's a good question, because for the past several years there hasn't been a lot of innovation. I mean, there's been a lot of cool stuff. Like we have the rise in progression and whatnot, and Intel trying to keep up. I have heard rumors that the current 10th generation Intel is going to be the last one on that kind of an architectural platform, so they're revamping it completely. That I think is going to be what's going to change it.
Pretty big, yeah. I mean, they're obviously chasing to catch up with AMD, and
well, and still put the Intel flair on it, because for single-threaded performance, Intel is the way to go. I mean, that's going to give you the best gaming performance. It's going to give you the best just general performance. Unless you're doing something multi-threaded, and then that's where the AMD side of things kind of comes to play. I mean, if Intel can keep that up, then we won't have a Pentium 4 fiasco.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, because AMD is also working on, a new graphics platform too, which all the next-gen consoles are using. And NVIDIA seems like they've just been dominating, but it'll be really cool to see AMD come out with something that can really take it to a 2080 or a 3000 series card. That's coming. And I'm waiting. I have my 1080. I'm kind of anxiously waiting for a new NVIDIA card to come out.
Oh yeah, so I guess it's going to be the Ampere. But yeah, I just see it as the current system with more processing power to do ray tracing and stuff.
Sure. Yeah, it doesn't seem like, even from Pascal to the 20 series, the 20 series to the new one, I haven't seen anything that looks like it's going to be monumental, but
no, and it's one of the common things that Darren brings up on the podcast is that the hardware is ahead of the software.
Yeah.
Which is true.
So
and it's always been that. So, we have a really super powerful graphics card. And if not Intel, but if NVIDIA took 2 years off, they would still have the fastest graphics card. But that's not how they roll. So we're going to have these incremental steps. But one of the things that caught Intel was that 4 cores was enough. And 4 cores was enough for like 6 years.
Yeah.
Until, the Ryzen came out. Well, and now we have to do more cores because of this. Not because we need them, but to keep a market advantage. So
interesting.
There's a lot of...
marketing and...
a lot of it's marketing. The new motherboards now, the 49, or the Z490s, which is the latest Intel series motherboard, they all look the same. So, they borrowed... I posted this on my news. It's like, I think they just shared the Cliff Notes. So it's like, hey, we want to have this board built. And, oh, well, you did this, you did that. Okay, I'm going to have that too.
We'll do that.
So the innovation has kind of gotten a little stagnant. And that's why it's hard to get excited about stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm hopeful.
I think for me, the thing with PCs in the last probably 5 years is just, it's not necessarily the hardware, but it's the cases and the buildability around that it has just been mind-blowing to me. Compared to the last computer I built, my most recent machine, the build quality, the thought that went into the case design and everything has been personally my favorite thing that I'm excited about, because it's making it more accessible, I think, for people to build that have never done it before. But also my current case, I feel like it'll last me forever. Of course, sans them coming out with new ports that I need, but and that's been really cool. I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, and that's where, and of course to react to that, it's like the designs. There's been a trend in the way cases are designed. And some of it is like Thermaltake has been focusing on water cooling. Well, they're focused on water cooling because they have their own line of water cooling hardware. So we keep it within our ecosystem. Silverstone has been traditionally releasing some really great cases, but they are struggling to the point where everything they released was really high end, and you can't really sell a lot of high end product. So they're trying to do mid market products as well, and some of them are hits and some of them are misses. But they're also designed for a completely different market, not really enthusiasts like us. So there's different segments, obviously, and cases are.
It's a tough
for
one.
every one good case that I see, there's a lot of them that aren't.
Totally.
And people ask me all the time. It's like, well, which should I look for when I buy a case? It's like, how much money do you have? So it's how much, and it really is. It's like you can spend $300 on a computer case, and it's going to be pretty darn cool, but it'll be it's self-contained unit. It's you're not going to be able to take parts from one and move it to another.
Totally.
If you get into more of the mid-range stuff around $100 or whatever, you might see chassis designs that are duplicated. Thermaltake was really good about, they had one base chassis.
And then they make cosmetics.
And then they put cosmetics on the outside of it to change it. And one of them would be designed for silent use, and that's really for the European market. Some of them would be high airflow, and that was for the U.S. market. And so you can mix and match those parts. That was the basis of the Darren's case.
Okay.
It was
match.
it started out as a View case, which was all glass and vertical GPU, but it was a silent design where it didn't have direct airflow. But there was a case called the X31 that was the same chassis, but it actually had a full vented grill in the front, and then it allowed you to use an external 5.25 drive. So you take the front bezel off of that, put it on this other case, and now you get all the nice things that timber glass side panels and good cooling.
Oh, that's cool. We haven't got to that level yet, but we're
Yeah.
swapping parts out of cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all
That was
modifications.
my last computer, and that was like, I don't know, the Newegg's top selling case at the time, so I thought it was pretty good. But,
Yeah.
No, you and I had that same
but
one.
even
double
since
tap.
then, like, cases have been crazy different. Like,
Yeah, I mean, the last two
RGB
cases.
everywhere.
Yeah, RGB, and I just love the buildability. I just think the access, and we got old cases where so many screws, and also now you can just pop stuff apart. And
Yeah, they made it easier.
I'm curious, and I think, if ATX, this form factor, the motherboard is going to change. We're seeing the smaller form factors. I'm just curious if the industry's going to go towards smaller, or if it's
There was a time when I thought the Mini ITX was going to be the premier platform.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it still is, because if you buy a Mini ITX motherboard,
You can fit it in almost anything.
you can fit it in almost everything. But in terms of features, the only thing you lose is 2 extra RAM slots and all of the expansion slots except for one. The boards have onboard really good audio. They have onboard Wi-Fi. They have onboard Ethernet. They have everything you could possibly need with one expansion slot. For 99% of the people out there, that's all you need. And you can put it in a small box. Now, those small boxes don't really cool very well, but that doesn't mean they have to always be in there. But it turns out that hasn't been as popular. Enthusiasts still want to have all the expandability. Yeah. Even though you only use one slot.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how that works. Like,
I remember when we used to really.
You had a lot of slots, and I still use mine. It's weird though. I like having the option.
Put a sound card in there.
Yeah, well, it's like anymore because you can't really do SLI anymore. I have motherboards that have 4 of these.
Quad SLI,
yeah, they support quad SLI. I have one board that's you have ATX is this long. This board's this long. And it has 2 extra slots. All to do quad SLI with extra space in between. Ironically, it was an MSI overclocking board. So
what do you even put in there anymore? What's the point of them now?
SLI.
All those extra.
I don't know.
Well, and see, that was the point I was getting at. Is that you used to have that because that was an NVIDIA marketing thing. Well, now you can't do SLI.
Yeah.
So you just have one slot for your graphics.
You
might
board.
Do a sound card, but anymore the onboard sound is actually pretty good.
Yeah, it's gotten really good. Well, and I'm using a DAC now. I'm using an external DAC now for my head, and it's like night and day.
Well, and
it's like
that's what Darren has 3 audios. He has an internal sound card, and then he has 2 DACs, and he'll just switch between each one depending on what headphones he's using.
I actually technically have 2. I guess you're right because I've got my monitor speakers and I have my gaming DACs.
And so you mean that removes the dependency on an expansion slot. It makes it a USB device.
Yeah.
So aside from a RAID card, for instance, right? You might have an extra M.2 you need to plug into an expansion slot. But, the current Z490s, they have 3 M.2s on.
Yeah.
So, it's getting to the point where you don't need all this stuff in which is sad because I like the expandability.
I do like it.
I pull out some of this old hardware and say, I want to run quad SLI this weekend. So I go and pull out the board that does it, and then I have to selectively pick the video cards that I want to run, and then find old drivers because the new drivers.
I guess that's a really good. You were talking about earlier, like hardware being in front of software. SLI, the idea was combining graphics cards for better performance, but software ultimately, companies weren't writing for it, right? Writing games optimized for it, so it just didn't really work out because there weren't enough people supporting the hardware that's there.
Well, and it was it put a lot of development effort on NVIDIA, which is one reason they phased it out. So NVIDIA would qualify the drivers to run with certain games.
Yeah.
So you'd have one game that would support SLI and one that didn't.
Yeah.
Now with DirectX 12, a lot of the linking of the GPU happens at the game level across the PCI Express bus.
Oh, interesting.
The same way that AMD does their linking with Crossfire.
Oh, interesting.
Because you don't have a bridge on Crossfire.
Yeah.
So the technology changed, and it pushed the development effort from NVIDIA to the game manufacturer.
Yeah,
and the game manufacturer isn't going to spend any time to link 2 video cards together.
Totally. Why would they when the vast majority are probably going to have one card?
Yeah. When SLI first came out, video cards were not very fast.
Yeah.
So it made sense to buy one and then buy another one when you had some more money.
Interesting.
Now it doesn't make much sense. Well, and on top of that, there's a whole lot of factors. Like when SLI first came out, it was at the 6 series level, which was mid-range. As it progressed, it started moving higher and higher up the chain to the point where it was only the Halo product, the high-end one, that would support linking 2 cards together. And at that level, your 1080s or whatever, they're already fast enough to play anything out there. You don't need another one. So
awesome.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a weird world.
Yeah.
How technology has changed everything.
I mean, it's we live it. You know, I mean, it's so fascinating. I mean, we couldn't even do this show if we weren't running on a computer right now. So,
Yeah. So many devices it takes to make this thing happen.
well, thank you so much, Dennis, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. You know, and hopefully in 2021 we'll be able to have you guys back to live Hackfort. You can probably do something fun with some overclocking and
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
yeah.
I felt like I did most of the talking.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, we really appreciate it.
Cool.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and till next time,
All right. Yeah. Thank
we'll catch you on the flip side.
See ya.
Every year you sponsor Hackfort, which is, for those of you who are not aware, this is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Every year you sponsor Hackfort, which is, for those of you who are not aware, Hackfort. This is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Hackfort. 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 Every year you sponsor Hackfort. 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 This is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Every year you sponsor Hackfort, which is, for those of you who are not aware, Hackfort is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Hackfort. Every year you sponsor Hackfort, which is, for those of you who are not aware, Hackfort is a tech festival that brings the community together to share knowledge and new skills with one another. Hackfort. Hackfort. For those of you who are not aware, Hackfort. 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 For those of you who are not aware, Hackfort. Hackfort.